Thank you for having me, and I really appreciate the invitation. I'm sorry I could not be there in person, but I lived most of my childhood, actually almost all of my childhood, aside from the first 2 years in East Brunswick, and graduated from East Brunswick High School in 2003. Um, so I will just begin. When we head to the grocery store, when we treat ourselves to new clothes or refill our water bottles, most of us aren't aware of every ingredient we're about to encounter. Instead, we put our trust in companies and governments to keep us safe in sort of an unwritten pact between supplier and consumer. Today, though, we're going to take a look at some cases in which that trust has been broken, focusing on communities that have weathered some of the most tragic effects of what has now become a global contamination crisis. So first, we are going to take a brief visit to Cortland, Alabama, to encounter one of these places. This is beautiful downtown Cortland. I was able to visit this historic town square, really picturesque Southern community in March 2023. What I saw there was a historic Southern town surrounded by sprawling greenery, a place that's home to one of the South's first railroads, a town that has nearly 200 years of architecture, ranging from the Victorian era to veranda-wrapped white picket fence cottages. But what I also saw while I was there was a huge amount of death and devastation. Let's now hear from Brenda Hampton, pictured here, who is an activist who took me on a ride through Portland in March 2023. In this photo, I am seated in the passenger seat, and she was saying what I am about to play for you at approximately the time of this photo. I'm going to put on the closed captions for you. The father and the mother, the father and the son had died there. The next house, the mother died at. The next house coming down the street, husband and wife died. The next house was husband and wife. The next house was a female that died. Young girl died here in this house here. I serviced this house. The husband died, and he had renal failure. The wife is still alive in there. The lady that lived in there, she's dead. Now, the thing about Brenda is she's just a regular person who in 2015 was undergoing a routine checkup as part of her managerial transfer for McDonald's from Boston to Tennessee. She was shocked to find out during that physical that she was in renal failure and that she had, quote, been exposed to something toxic. What she said to me was what I was working with, it was nothing toxic. It was hamburgers and French fries. She was so startled, however, that she decided to move back to her hometown, where she had spent her entire childhood and young adulthood as well. And that was to Cortland, Alabama, because her daughters were still there to help get her through that illness. Now, if you take a look at the map, I want you to notice there's Cortland and there's North Cortland right above it. These are the twin Cortlands. We kind of think of them as, and each town has just a few hundred residents. So Brenda is super curious. She's a really smart person, and she very quickly observed how sick people were in both Cortlands. She found 54 cases of cancer and 14 of kidney failure in 2 streets alone. Now, Brenda and her neighbors, all they were doing was trusting the tap, which is something that each of us do daily. But Cortland residents eventually found out that their water was contaminated by compounds known as PFAS. Brenda self-funded efforts to distribute supplies and drive neighbors to medical appointments, but she herself has hardly been spared. In addition to her kidney failure, Brenda has since suffered 2 heart attacks and a stroke. Now, what are PFAS? Well, they are per and polyfluoral alkyl substances, if that tells you something. But really, they are the acronym for about 15,000 synthetic organofluorines, meaning 15,000 chemicals that are all man-made, and that is an estimate. If you would ask scientists a few years ago, they'd say 7,000, 9,000. Now the estimate is up to about 15,000. They're in many household items, such as waterproof fabrics, nonstick pans, cosmetics, and certain types of firefighting foams. And I bet every single person who is either watching this in that room in the library or on their computer is wearing something with PFAS in it right now, probably including myself. The water and stain resistant properties of PFAS have made them incredibly useful, even critical sometimes, in medical devices like heart valves, in first responder gear, and in semiconductors. Well, that sounds great. So, what's the problem? Well, PFAS don't break down in the environment at all. They linger in the human body by binding to proteins in the blood of at least 97% of Americans, according to the CDC. They're linked to many cancers and kidney, thyroid, heart, reproductive, and immune issues. And as I saw in Cortland, downstream from massive industrial discharges, the effects can be dire. And with such risky effects, you might think that regulators were quick to step in, but the EPA took decades to regulate just a few kinds of PFAS. They're forever and they're everywhere. But they weren't always. And before we dive into the birth of Forever Chemicals, I just want to show you a brief outline as to what to expect today, right here. So, as I just said, PFAS are forever and everywhere, but they weren't always. In fact, their birth was entirely accidental. Their birth actually occurred in New Jersey, thanks to postdoctoral scholar Roy Plunkett, who was working on replacements for hazardous refrigerants at a DuPont lab in 1938. That lab is known as Deepwater, if you've ever heard of it. So for Roy, this meant that he was storing cold cylinders of tetrafluoroethylene gas, also known as TFE gas, and he assumed that that gas would remain a gas. But upon opening the cylinders, Roy found a mysterious white powder. Upon further research, what he eventually understood was that the TFE had undergone a process called polymerization, in which a carbon-carbon double bond in a TFE breaks apart and attacks others. The powder that formed as a result was heat resistant and most things didn't stick to it. So DuPont liked that and decided to trademark the compound as poly-TFE or PTFE, or as we may know it, Teflon in 1944. Now, the properties of Teflon really quickly appealed to the US military. It was resistant to heat and corrosion, and it didn't interact with other chemicals. So one of its first uses was to contain highly reactive materials like uranium in the making of the atom bomb. Teflon actually only reached consumers thanks to an inventor across the world in Rumilly, France, a small town in France. So an inventor there named Marc Gregoire started coating his own pans with Teflon, and then he launched the company Tefal in 1956. Tefal began exporting its products to the US in 1961, and in no small part became hugely popular thanks to a random photograph taken of Jackie Kennedy purchasing a Teflon-coated pan. Now, I'd like you to see an ad from this era for Teflon, just so you can get an idea as to what was on TV about the products at the time.
Ladies, no more scraping, no more grinding, no more scouring, no more problems, no more mess with new Slip Away. You just spray, bake, and slip away. Yes, here in this handy spray can is new Slip Away, the revolutionary new non-stick coating for pots, pans, ovens, and grills. And Slip Away contains the magic of DuPont Teflon. Just spray the surface of your cooking utensils, bake in the oven for 30 minutes, and your Slip Away non-stick surface will literally last for months.
So not everything was as shiny as these pans present themselves to be, because actually a lot of toxicological research was already happening beneath the scenes at the companies themselves. I'll give you some examples. In the 1950s, researchers inside and outside of DuPont found that some people exposed to heated Teflon were developing flu-like effects. That was called polymer fume fever at the time. In 1959, an FDA official wrote that Teflon may be unstable under cooking temperatures and that some decomposition products are quite toxic. And yet, the same FDA went on to approve Teflon-coated cookware. 1961, a DuPont toxicologist warned that some PFAS could cause liver enlargement in rats. 1978, another company, 3M, which also produced PFAS, found it in the blood of its employees, with fluorine levels proportional to the length of time they worked there and persisting in some for 15 to 20 years. By 1981, 3M found something so problematic about one type of PFAS called PFOA that it alerted the EPA, and that was a link to birth defects in rats. Now, in that alert, it said that fetuses of rats that had consumed PFOA developed eye deformities. But the alert also emphasized that, quote, no human health problems have been observed. Now, one of the places where 3M and other industries set up shop was in northern Alabama, near the city of Decatur and upstream from Brenda's community in Cortland. So here we have Cortland. There we have 3M, established in 1961, right next to the city of Decatur. And Cortland is actually located downstream, despite how the map looks like it's going up, that's really downstream. So by 1976, 3M Indicator found one notorious type of PFAS, it's called PFOS, in a Decatur worker's blood, and then again in the blood of several employees in 1979. In the 1990s, 3M scientists cited interest in possible health risks to Decatur workers regarding liver and bladder cancers, as well as endocrine and reproductive disorders. Now, the effects were also seeping beyond the factory bounds. In 1979, PFAS were found in fish caught in the river around Wheeler Dam and in the water utilities downstream from the plant. Now, this picture that you see here is of Wheeler Dam. I took it in when I was visiting there in March 2023. And I will note that there were fisher folk set up everywhere, fishing in this highly, highly contaminated area and taking home these fish for their family members to eat, despite some minimal signage saying that it was not safe to do so, but people are largely ignoring those signs. So in 2007 to 2010, finally the federal government, the regional branch, stepped in and started testing the water in this area after one company reported that it had, quote, unknowingly discharged large amounts of PFAS. 2014, the CDC's toxic registry, the ATSDR, took community blood samples, and those showed that PFOA and PFOS levels of community members were 2 to 4 times higher than US averages. So many plants still line the Tennessee River today, and they're allowed to dump according to Alabama law, even though the EPA deems the area impaired with PFOS and with agricultural materials. That said, companies have at times violated their legal bounds, doing things like underreporting PFAS releases and breaching contracts. But the thing is, in this region, these plants are a pillar for Decatur, for Cortland, for this entire community, and a major employer. I think the former city council president, Paige Beebe, put it really nicely. She said, look at Decatur's history, anything and everything we have. If it's to the hospital benefit or anybody, you look on the program, who is the platinum giver? 3M. And then Brenda Hampton, whom we met earlier, had something similar to say and also reflected on Alabama's lack of regulation. She said they are still taking advantage of Alabama. Nobody goes by any rules. Nobody questions anything. But one person who actually was questioning things a lot was Brenda Hampton herself. Amidst all this lack of regulation, Brenda took it upon herself to recruit a small cohort of fellow activists as well as scientists to her side. They've pushed through lawsuits, they've tested water, they've exposed injustices in the media. But in doing so, Brenda has made herself an enemy of locals who rely on industry. I said that this region is so dependent on these industries for jobs. So Brenda said she was shot at, she had 2 cars destroyed, and she found that someone had broken into her truck and left a cut-up Chucky doll. But her efforts helped secure a settlement between 3M and her water utility. And in 2019, that settlement led to a $35 million payout from 3M. in which the company doled out some small checks to affected residents, but perhaps more importantly, enabled the local utility to build a reverse osmosis treatment plant along the Tennessee River. So, what that has meant for Brenda and her neighbors is that they can now get PFAS-free water flowing through their taps. And that's a picture of the actual facility, the outside of the reverse osmosis facility. Now, this was just the first of multiple settlements between 3M and area residents. The next one involved the school. I'm going to just get very briefly into it, but in the book, you can hear all the municipal and city council drama. It's actually quite interesting. I'm a bit biased, but that's what I feel. So within Decatur itself, there were people possibly paying the price as well from all this contamination. And those were teachers and students who had attended Brookhaven Middle School from 1971 to 2018. Their school was built atop a landfill that operated in the 1940s through the 1960s. And 3M has since admitted to dumping there for about a year during landfill operations. The school district, like Brenda, took legal action and settled with 3M. And 3M eventually bought the site for $1.25 million despite its $487,500 value and then began demolition. Now, I'm just bringing back these pictures, which were from that March 2023 visit. I was able to visit the site, the demolition site, as it was going with the person you will meet here in a second, Pat Underwood. And again, that was March 2023. So note that by November 2023, 3M already declared the green space is suitable for public use, even though pre-demolition plans showed significant PFOS levels at test sites there. And when I asked the Alabama Department of Environmental Management about it, they just kind of shrugged their shoulders and deferred to 3M. So very quickly, I'd like you to hear from Pat Underwood, who is a graduate of this middle school. He's about 40 now, so it was a while ago. But he's a martial artist, former volunteer for Tennessee Riverkeeper, and he's known locally as the Trash Ninja.
Landfill. Like it wasn't a hidden thing. Like we all were in on it. And the joke that we all just subscribed to was that the school was sinking 3 inches or something a year. Mm-hmm. And that eventually when we were old in our 30s and 40s, like how old that was gonna be, mm-hmm. Like that, which isn't old, like that the school was just gonna sink into the ground. Little did we know that there was some serious industrial contaminants in that landfill.
So the drama in Decatur has continued with the city of Decatur also embroiled in a lawsuit. And Decatur, the county, and the utility ended up settling with 3M for nearly $100 million. But former council members, like the one I quoted earlier, Paige Beebe, have maintained that the negotiations and the deal were both flawed, in large part due to the ties between city leadership and industry. Now, you'll note here that the $35 million allocated for Decatur went to building a new rec center. A lot of residents and environmentalists were very upset with this because they wanted the money to go to cleaning up contamination. But there were some real estate interests that were kind of tied into both the city council and tied into the companies that were pushing for this rec center project. Again, complex city council dynamics that you can read about, but I will just add this one quote from an environmental attorney in the region, and he said, 3M, I believed then and would believe now, knew they had most of the leaders of the county in their pocket on their side. And there are also plenty of reactions from 3M in the book as well. So the experiences of Northern Alabama really showed us the lasting impact of PFAS producers on adjacent communities. But industry is not alone. The military has also been part of this journey since day one. So now I'd like to go to Colorado to see another example. And this is Colorado Springs area, which is about 2 hours south of where I am sitting in Boulder. So, welcome to beautiful El Paso County, Colorado. If you've never been, that region has these natural wonders. They're called Garden of the Gods. It's a park filled with massive red rock formations. It's so beautiful. But these areas are also home to several military installations. There are more than just these, but the biggest ones are really Peterson Space Force Base, U.S. Air Force Academy, and the U.S. Army's Fort Carson. About 45,000 military personnel, 15,000 federal workers, and 90,000 veterans reside in this region. And so you have a little bit of a lay of the land here. The areas in white are the contamination areas of focus, with Strathmore, or some people call it Strathmore Valley, being a southern neighborhood of Colorado Springs that was not on the municipal water system, and Security and Widefield being suburbs of the city. There is Peterson Space Force Base, and there is Fort Carson. Now, although PFAS had early roots in World War II, remember with the making of the atom bomb, the military's usage took off in the 1960s. Now, that was because the Navy, after a catastrophic ship fire, started working with 3M to develop AFFF, which is a foam that suppressed jet fuel-based fires. By 1979, AFFF was present at more than 90 U.S. civilian airports, and hundreds of military sites use the foam in emergencies and in training drills. Now, just like the toxicological reports that were occurring at the companies like 3M and DuPont, the military reports show that the Department of Defense was also looking into the toxicity of PFAS, specifically of AFFF, for decades. I'll give you some examples, but there are many more. One report from 1971 cited a threat to fish called AFFF a serious pollutant that didn't break down. 1985, a report conducted at Peterson labeled AFFF as hazardous. By 2016, the Army Corps of Engineers found PFAS in samples at Peterson and cited potential non-carcinogenic risks to human health and the environment, as well as the migration of PFAS to downstream wells. Now, interestingly, Fort Carson, the U.S. Army base, started listening to its own advice in the reports and switched to using water for training purposes in 1993. The Army base replaced AFFF entirely in 2018. But Peterson took much longer. Now, it's really hard to get a clear answer as to why, but one theory that was raised was that the Air Force simply has more planes, and jet fuel is very flammable at high temperatures and can lead to catastrophic events if burned. The Federal Aviation Administration also required its firefighters to test and train with AFFF at civilian airports. And in many cases, when this was not properly contained, not always, but often, this flowed into the environment until 2019 when it was banned for training use. The Department of Defense eventually instituted a military-wide ban on AFFF for training purposes and then pledged to cease its use entirely by 2024. This has largely occurred from what I've heard, but there have been some delays, and there are now also reports from the current administration that things are getting slowed down, but I will get to that later. In 2021, however, this was something nice, and I actually got to see a bit of this when I toured the base in May 2023, because this was still ongoing. The Air Force Civil Engineering Unit actually launched PFAS removal pilot programs at Peterson Space Force Base. So what that has meant is that they have made this into like a field laboratory almost, and they are bringing in scientists from regional local universities who are interested in testing out their technologies to degrade PFAS, to remove PFAS, et cetera, on the base itself. So that was cool to see. But as of 2023, the Air Force had spent a total of more than $103 million on PFAS remediation at Peterson alone. And now I believe the Defense Department's estimates of bases that need PFAS remediation is about 539 at this point. So imagine just how many tax dollars we now need to spend on cleaning up this problem that we created. And I'll just show you, despite the fence, I want you to see this picture from Peterson Space Force Base. You can see here a plane, if you look closely in the background, It's actually a charred plane. And what they would used to do is they would set that plane on fire on purpose, and then they would train with using the AFFF foam to put it out, and then it would leach directly into the environment. Now, I'd like you to meet Mark Favors. He's another main character in the book. He grew up next to these bases during the Cold War era, part of a tightly knit black family in largely white Colorado Springs. And as Mark tells it, Cold War era patriotism really molded this city into a libertarian stronghold in which small government ideology reigned supreme and politics were just highly discouraged. Military service, on the other hand, was all but compulsory in the community. So, Mark is today an ICU nurse at Harlem Hospital in New York City, but he himself is a veteran, as are many of his relatives, most of whom are still in the Colorado Springs area. So, Mark estimates that more than 2 dozen relatives have suffered serious illnesses, and he attributes those illnesses to PFAS releases from the bases. At least 5 family members have endured kidney-related diseases. And I want to emphasize that a lot of these relatives are in-laws, step siblings. They are not necessarily genetically related to each other. Now, Mark's acquaintance with PFAS only came as he sought answers for many, many years for the untimely death of his grandmother, Arletha Bragg, who had died in 1991. And again, to emphasize that genetics point, you can see Arletha pictured left here. That's his paternal grandmother. And on the right is Ivory Mitchell, his maternal aunt. Both of them spent most of their time in a similar area, similar contaminated area, and neither was related to each other, and they both died young of cancers. So Mark actually randomly heard about PFAS on a local news report in Colorado Springs when he was visiting his mother in 2018, and he decided to start digging himself. Now, a great thing about Colorado's Department of Public Health and Environment is that they have a lot of data available. So he was able to access the numbers that he was seeking. And he learned that PFAS levels near Arletha's former house in Widefield far exceeded EPA health advisories. Mark's cousins, veteran Steve Patterson, you see him on the bottom here, and his sister Princess, you see her on the mural above, they spent their youth in the highly contaminated Strathmore Valley part of Colorado Springs. Princess developed lupus-related kidney damage as a teenager and then went on to get bladder cancer. So Steve was actually a match for his sister, which is fairly rare. So he was able to give her a kidney, but then the cancer returned to her liver, kidneys, spine, anus, and brain, and she eventually died. And that is why she's here on a mural in front of the school where she taught. Steve, though, wasn't spared either. He eventually developed prostate and rectal cancers. He is currently in remission for both, but his health is kind of not the greatest at this moment. But I wanted to include a clip from something he said about how this family just copes with so many people being ill, and even sometimes dying.
What can we do? So if you see we're happy, we hang together, we laugh, we have fun, even though we just lost a brother, we just lost a cousin, and life goes on. I mean, cry at the funeral, but sometimes we ain't crying because I don't think we have any more tears left because it's just been so many deaths. It's just been too many.
So Steve's cousin Mark, one of the main characters here that we just met before, has actually taken this fight, the family's fight, nationally. And starting in November 2019, Mark testified before the House, before the subcommittee on environment, about his family, and he urged Congress to launch an investigation into the PFAS issue. At the time, he spoke alongside Mark Ruffalo, who portrayed lawyer Rob Balot's fight against DuPont in West Virginia in the film Dark Waters, if you've ever seen it. Now, at this hearing, there was actually largely bipartisan support for a potential either investigation or further look into this, perhaps for different reasons, but still bipartisan. For example, Representative James Comer, a Republican from Kentucky, said that while he opposed sweeping actions that could cause economic harm, he supported compensating families, quote, poisoned intentionally by corporate America. And representatives from the other side of the aisle also noted the need for an investigation. However, notice the date on this was November 2019, and about like a month and a half later, a global pandemic really kicked off. So a lot of progress was delayed on this. And yet Mark has really not given up. He continues to testify in Congress about this issue. Most recently, about 4 months ago, was the last time, I believe. And Mark's goals are to, quote, find out what really happened and hold people accountable if there was something nefarious, as the documents imply. Now, one reason why Mark wants to investigate this in Congress is because doing so is so difficult in court. And that's because of the lack of legal recourse, which in a lot of cases stems from state level laws called statutes of limitations, which are laws defining the amount of time people have to sue. So, just to give you some examples, Colorado has a strict 2-year statute of limitations, but victims can wait to sue until finding a clear cause for injury. Compare that to Alabama, where people can only sue within 2 years of becoming ill. So, if you become ill from your toxic exposure, chances are you're not going to learn that it was because of PFAS, like within 2 years of becoming ill. So that renders it virtually impossible in Alabama. So some of Mark's relatives have actually joined a massive multi-district litigation called an MDL, which has grouped thousands of claims versus AFFF producers before a federal judge in South Carolina. Now that, you should note, is only against AFFF producers. So not producers of all types of PFAS, and also only the producers, only the companies. Suing the military is so hard due to the federal government's discretionary function immunity shield, which really holds up except in extreme scenarios. But for Mark, anyway, there isn't a sum of money that could really make up for his family's losses, and this is how he puts it. There's not enough money in the US Treasury for my grandmother. So, Colorado itself, we didn't really get into the laws in Colorado because we were talking more about a federal issue, but Colorado actually has been able to advance a considerable amount of PFAS related legislation on a state level. But I wanted to give you an example of a state with like some of the most farthest reaching PFAS laws in the country. Interestingly, though, that state was also responsible for much of its own PFAS problems, and that is the state of Maine, and we are specifically going to central Maine. And these are the 3 areas of interest in the book, but today we will focus on Arundel, which is very close to the border with New Hampshire, about a half hour away. And in Arundel, we will meet Fred Stone, who he is the quirkiest of personalities, a wonderful human being who considers his cows basically members of his family. As you can see, these are the decorations in his house, and his license plate at the farm is Dairy O, and he is well versed on diseases of cattle, revised edition from, I believe it's 1918. Now, Fred has been a longtime owner of his farm, Stone Ridge. His grandfather purchased this 18th century farm from another family when his grandfather came back from serving in World War I in 1914. Then it passed down a couple times, and Fred and Laura, his wife Laura, bought it from Fred's parents in 1977. So for Fred, there's a date of doom in his life, and that is November 3rd, 2016, when he received a letter from Kennebunk Water District saying that PFAS in his Wells aquifer were double EPA's health advisory levels. The Stones decided to test their cow's milk because they knew that the cows were drinking this water, and this was all voluntary. Nobody was forcing them to do so at the time. And it came back with sky-high PFAS levels. Now, this was also much to the resentment of their neighbors, who now had to follow suit because they set a precedent of needing to test cow milk in the region. Stone Ridge was immediately suspended from shipping milk. Fred and Laura decided to install a $23,000 water filtration system in May 2017. And after about a year, like that's how long it took to clear up the PFAS in the cows' systems, then their milk was clean again, and they were able to start selling the milk again. And then just a few months later, suddenly the milk was testing for PFAS again. What had happened? Fred had switched the cows to a new feed, and it turns out that the feed was being grown on a farm that was also contaminated with PFAS. And at this point, he just sort of threw up his hands and said, I can't do this anymore. But Fred recalled how way before state officials became familiar with PFAS, so when this contamination was first discovered, an environmental inspector suggested to him that he exterminate his herd as if they had an infectious disease. And this is what Fred Stone had to say about that.
It said, we'll go down to the compost site because we have a thing for, exterminating animals. And I said, and again, these cow families go way back to, 40, 50 years, and generations and generations and lineage and what have you. So I said, I'll tell you what, Tanya, I said, I'll do that. We'll take them all down there. I'll put on my show white, and I'll stand in front, and I'll take the first bullet, and then you can slaughter the rest of them. A week later, I get a letter from the state of Maine about suicide prevention.
That's Fred in a nutshell, and he is absolutely serious. That is not a joke. Now, in June 2017, Maine's Department of Environmental Protection finally identified the source of the contamination, and that was from the 1983 to 2004 spread of something called sludge. What is sludge? Well, sludge is the semi-solids that are left over after sewage treatment. And much of Maine's sludge comes from treatment lagoons on site at the state's paper mills. There are so many paper mills in Maine. And many have used PFAS in their pulping processes. The treatment removes solids, but it doesn't remove PFAS. Some of the PFAS sticks to the solids and some stays in the water. But who conducted the spreading of the sludge? Well, it was none other than Fred Stone himself. At Maine's bidding, he had slathered his fields and others with what he thought was nutritious fertilizer. Basically, what had happened was utilities were peddling sludge to farmers for free as a win-win. Utilities didn't need to pay for landfilling, and farmers got free fertilizer. This all occurred with the support, the encouragement of the state of Maine, because the state was struggling with a shortage of dump space, largely due to a 1989 ban on the establishment of new private dumping sites. So yet again, Fred being Fred, during another environmental inspection, Fred was equipped with choice words and decades-old documents. This guy has a whole filing cabinet of decades-old documents in his garage. And here is one of them from 1986. This is a permit from the Department of Environmental Protection telling him that he can spread the sludge. And it indicates here that doing so will not pollute any water of the state of Maine. And it's signed by the commissioner of the department at the time. And here is what Fred had to say about this situation.
And because I am a complete a-hole, I walked over into my filing cabinet and pulled out a permit from '86, and it is on Department of Environmental Protection's masthead. It states this material will not contaminate any waters in the state of Maine. This material will not present health hazard. There's a whole laundry list goes through. And on the backside, it is signed by the commissioner at the time of DEP. And just because I'm really go for the gold, I also included the letter from Cayman Water stating that the water in the aquifers at 146 was contaminated. And games had match. I'm positive that the poor girl from DEP did not know that those documents existed.
So there's the second document he presented, which was his contamination notice. And I did ask the department about this, but they just said that the 1983, and that was the renewed 1986 license, were issued decades before DEP had standards in place for PFAS, which is true. Now, Fred Stone himself has become some sort of an accidental activist. He will actually tell you he's not an activist at all. He's not an environmentalist. He is not an organic farmer. He's a traditional farmer. He will tell you that he just wants people to be healthy and have clean water. He describes himself as a staunch anti-Trump Republican who joined hands with local Democrat Henry Ingwerson to advance PFAS bills through Maine state legislature. And because of their joint work, Maine has had a lot of achievements now, such as granting people more time to sue. And then a national first. The state was the first to ban all products with intentionally added PFAS, which is occurring in increments. And the near full ban should be in place by 2030 at this point. A lot of states now have caught up with the PFAS-based firefighting foam bans, the bans on AFFF. But another national first was a ban on PFAS-laden sludge application to farms. So they really started taking action on this major sludge issue. And it's still one of the only states, there are a couple others, but it's one of the only states to do so. And in March 2024, there was a $60 million PFAS fund established for buybacks of polluted farmland. So although Fred helped create that buyback fund, he said he's not too keen on it due to his farm's historic nature. He doesn't want it to go into random hands. And yet, business is rough. The Stones had to file for Chapter 12 bankruptcy on their house, and they get food stamps as well as subsidized health care. They're currently exploring alternative uses of their land, and I believe they have now signed with a solar panel company that will be putting panels on the contaminated land. But Fred maintains there's not a whole lot of lead in our pencils. So we've had a look at how local communities and states have both created and coped with the threats posed by PFAS. But before concluding, I wanted to take a broader look at how the federal government is faring. And I'll take a brief stop in New Jersey as well, and then end with some potential solutions. So I'm just going to go back to the Obama era. We go back a little bit further in the book, but during the Obama era, PFAS was not a priority at all. Some research did occur, however. The EPA under Obama did update the 1976 Toxics Law, and chemicals would now need to be proven innocent to enter the market rather than proven guilty to be removed. In 2012, the Obama EPA found a new type of PFAS, Gen X, in North Carolina's Cape Fear River via another DuPont facility, and residents in that region were sick. But interestingly, blood samples taken by that EPA didn't show Gen X in the blood. Instead, they identified 3 new types of PFAS. So hence the whack-a-mole image. It's like you get rid of one, you keep more PFAS just keep popping up. And these particular ones were called ultra short chain PFAS, and they're capable of also sneaking through municipal filter systems. So just so you have some of the terminology here, the legacy ones that I was talking about earlier, PFOA and PFOS, we call those long chain. Gen X is kind of medium, it's short chain. And the ultra short chain ones are those that have 3 or fewer carbon atoms. And during this same era, also during the same time as the Obama EPA, there was a whack-a-mole occurring in terms of corporate PFAS handling. So DuPont was spinning off its PFAS businesses, and it kept trading hands, going from one to another, like it would disappear, reappear. And DuPont's response to that is in 2019, DuPont de Nemours was established as a new multi-industrial specialty products company. DuPont de Nemours has never manufactured or sold PFOA, PFOS, Gen X, or firefighting foam. So take that as it is. Trump 1.0. I won't spend too much time on this because we're already at Trump 2.0 at this point, but that EPA said it would assess the need for drinking water regulations for PFAS, but did never set them. An employee of his EPA recalled writing a rule to deem PFOA and PFOS as hazardous, but it was like waiting for Godot because it just sat there. There were a bunch of lingering and even new loopholes created. So new PFAS were approved during the CPA via a loophole that allows looser review for chemicals produced in small quantities. And a second loophole was created, and that weakened toxic release reporting requirements. Career staffers from the EPA, like ones who had been there for multiple administrations, said they tried to warn legislators that this was about to occur, but they were blocked by Trump political appointees. The Biden EPA then closed that second loophole in December 2023. Now, a pivotal moment for PFAS really arrived in April 2024. And that was when the EPA finally set the country's first federal drinking water standards for PFAS. And it was for 6 types of PFAS. Just so that you have an understanding of what a part per trillion is, you see these numbers here. PPT is parts per trillion. 1 part per trillion is equivalent to about a couple drops of water in 20 Olympic-size pools. So under these rules, public systems would need to monitor for 6 types of PFAS and fix all issues by 2029. Biden's EPA also designated PFOA and PFOS as hazardous under CERCLA, the Superfund Cleanup Law, and that makes it easier to force polluters to clean up or to pay for contamination. The Trump 2.0 EPA has had something a bit different in mind, however. So, in May 2025, the EPA announced that it intends to rescind and reconsider limits on 4 of the 6 PFAS from 2024. Only PFOA and PFOS will be maintained, but compliance on those 2 will be extended from 2029 to 2031. So 2 more years to be able to have PFOA and PFOS in municipal systems. In the fiscal year 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress recently proposed delaying the AFFF phase out, allowing for PFAS incineration, re-enabling Pentagon purchases of PFAS products, and cutting about $200 million in cleanup funds. The EPA also postponed reporting deadlines for companies that produced or imported PFAS from 2011 to 2022. On the other hand, however, this was good news for regulation, the EPA just announced that it would actually maintain the hazardous designations for PFOS and PFOA, despite media reports of a possible repeal. So that was a surprise, and we will have to see what happens with the rest of it. So just to take us back home to New Jersey for a bit, there really is quite a contamination crisis in the Garden State when it comes to PFAS. New Jersey ranks among the most PFAS polluted states nationwide. It grapples with decades of PFAS exposure from industry and military sites, such as Joint Base McGuire Dix Lakehurst. About 6% of New Jersey's 9.2 million residents are estimated to be drinking PFAS polluted water, according to a study published in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And there's a number of studies occurring, but I just wanted to cite one. There's an EOSHI study from Rutgers from Paulsboro that showed that PFNA blood levels were 285% higher than US averages, and that was likely linked to Solvay specialty polymers. And this graphic that I included here, it kind of shows you how PFAS gets into your system, and this was available on the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's website if anyone would like to look for it. So now where New Jersey stands. New Jersey actually has decent PFAS regulation and legislation. In 2018, it was the first state to adopt any regulatory standards for PFAS. And you see here this 14 parts per trillion for PFOA and the 13 for PFOS. Those are higher than the federal standards, which are 4 parts per trillion. But at least New Jersey has something for PFNA. So you have to take what you can get in this situation. In 2019, it was the first state to order companies to address PFAS pollution. In 2021, public systems had to start monitoring for PFOA and PFOS. And by the end of that year, private well owners did as well. And that's really rare. The attention on private wells in New Jersey is actually fairly advanced. And that's important because the Federal Drinking Water Act does not involve the monitoring of private wells. By 2024, public systems and landlords needed to provide notice of elevated PFAS levels in drinking water. And in 2025, this year, so actually really just a month or two ago, there was a $2 billion settlement with DuPont, Chemours, and Corteva with $875 million payout and up to $1.2 billion to be provided in cleanup costs. And these are associated with Pompton Lakes Works in Passaic, Rapano Works in Gloucester, Chambers Works in Salem, and DuPont Parlin in Middlesex. And by next year, a ban on PFAS-based firefighting foams takes effect. To get really local, Middlesex County itself has been fairly messy, and that contamination has stemmed from the Brunswick aquifer. So in 2021, Middlesex County Water alerted its customers, or some of its customers, around 300,000 people, about excess PFAS in South Plainfield, Edison, Metuchen, Woodbridge, Clark, and Rahway via the Park Avenue well field in South Plainfield. Park Avenue was upgraded to meet state thresholds, but PFOA and PFOS levels still exceed stricter EPA standards. You can see here that the range I highlighted in yellow for PFOA and PFOS is up to 9 parts per trillion or 5 parts per trillion for PFOS, and those federal thresholds are 4 as a reminder. Now, to get really, really, really local, to East Brunswick. So East Brunswick is in the Raritan River water basin, but it purchases surface water from the New Jersey Water Supply Authority, which operates the Spruce Run Round Valley Reservoir System in Hunterdon County. The water is processed by Middlesex Water Company at the Carl J. Olson Water Treatment Plant in Edison. Now, to look at your 2024 annual drinking water quality report, which you all have access to. So we have some issues here. The upper ends of, The upper ends of PFAS and PFOA ranges once again surpass federal thresholds. So we have for PFOS 4.3 is the upper end of the range of PFOA. We have upper end is 7.7. So those are not great. They could be worse, but they're not great. In general, we do have solutions. We are removing PFAS from drinking water in municipalities nationwide, in homes nationwide. A lot of these are available as home systems as well. 3 main technologies do so. We have granular activated carbon, which is a sponge-like system that basically traps the PFAS. There's reverse osmosis, which basically creates a barrier that separates the PFAS from the clean water. And then there's ion exchange, which I don't have to get into the specifics, but that's what they use in Colorado, where you have to actually really conserve a lot of water because reverse osmosis consumes a lot of water. Ion exchange does not. And in the US West, there's a priority placed on conservation of water as well. So that's what that facility looks like here. Now, while these technologies remove PFAS, they don't destroy them. Instead, the chemicals end up becoming someone else's problem. So unless there's a magical solution. Well, not exactly, not really, but scientists and labs around the world are luckily innovating techniques for degrading PFAS, and some of their methods are market ready. Essentially, they are breaking the unbreakable. And there are 3 main categories in which they are doing so. I'm not going to get into the details of what those mean right now, but that's electrochemical oxidation, low temperature plasma treatment, and sonolysis. The one that I will get into a slight bit of detail is a tool that's already operating at pilot commercial scale, and that's called the PFAS Annihilator Reactor, developed by Revive Environmental and the Battelle Memorial Institute. It's a nonprofit company. So there, reaction occurs in supercritical water, which is neither liquid nor gas, but has the properties of both under immense high temperature and pressure. Gases that don't dissolve in water are now able to, creating a super solvent fluid that is expandable and compressible, and in which reactions can occur with fewer limits. So oxidants, which are able to accept electrons from other substances, then catalyze the breakdown of the carbon-fluorine bond. The carbon-fluorine bond is this really formidable entity that has been so difficult to break because it's so strong. And that is the problem. That is what is making these chemicals forever chemicals. So what's left in this situation is PFAS-free water, carbon dioxide, and inert salts. And if the PFAS arrives in concentrate, say from a granular activated carbon filter, if they send the filter filled with PFAS, the reactor, which fits in a 20-foot shipping container, can treat the equivalent of 500,000 gallons of effluent daily. Revive has several PFAS annihilators up and running, as do several other startups have similar technologies up and running as pilot programs. So this is a bit encouraging, although you do have to step back and say this is a global scale problem. There is not a corner of this planet that is not touched by PFAS. So it will take a lot of money and a lot of time to really clean up this problem. However, I wanted to end on a quote in which the CEO of Revive Environmental really characterizes that nature of this strong carbon-fluorine bond. And he says, "This is like The Rock and John Cena holding hands, and you're trying to break that." So that is Poisoning the Well. My email is there. I am happy to take any questions at this point, and I appreciate you listening.